our State of the Union for November. Does this fall mailing season seem much heavier and busier than recent years? I would say yes. In September, those of you who are on the call, we saw a precipitous rise in revenues coming off mailing. October, spoiler alert for our caging, was a little bit more flat. As we suspected, there may have been some revenues that we were pulling from October into September, likely as well. But yes, and I would also say that we've seen how for-profits have to some extent rediscovered the mail, had some interesting insights. We just had our Innovation Summit last week. People, the parent company of People Magazine and one of the largest publishers in the world and the largest print publisher in the United States, and they were talking about how their fastest growing digital properties also have print assets along with them. So it's good to see that omni-channel approach that we all talk about and we want to get to really does bear fruit. I think you're seeing retailers discover that as well, even folks like Amazon doing mailing. So ties right into our caging results. Revenue was basically flat, down 0.4%. So rounding error, the number of contributions down. We did see that go up in September. Now it's back down. That's a little bit more representative, although a little bit further down than what we've seen throughout the year, which is revenues up, contributions slightly down. Sector by sector, about half and half. Public broadcasting continues to do well, likely because people are reacting to them losing their federal funding. Faith communities, a large part of that is contributions about the war in Gaza. So see a lot of that. Animal rescue education down significantly in the month, although not as much overall. Average gifts, those of you doing the math found out if revenue was about flat and contributions down significantly, average gift has to be up significantly, and yes, it was. So not a huge shock there. The education folks had the lower revenue here. Great. That was mitigated by that 44% drop in contributions was mitigated by a significant increase in average gift. Year to date, we are seeing, and I'm sorry that this title is incorrect, revenues up by about 5%, contributions down 2.3%. So that's where the trend is for the year and likely will stay there. Weird things happen in November and December. I'm not discounting that as an option because, hey, we live in a world of weird things sometimes. By sector, generally speaking, sectors are growing. Those that are down are on the slighter side of things. Shout out any questions you have about this as we go through. Otherwise, I'll go through a new study that is fairly intuitive for those involved in nonprofit direct marketing, but does bear repeating. They looked at altruistic behavior and charitable giving, a control of why you should donate, and then they added on a narrative to one version, first person narrative. Here's the person you're helping, here's their age, here's their story. That sort of effective altruism that you have a moral obligation to help those, and you can do so by donating most effectively. Facts of the numerical implications of what you can do, talking about the virtue ethics of what are going on. And then we've talked about that empathy, that imagine language can be very effective. And not shockingly, all of these performed better than just the facts. Also, I would say not shockingly, the appeal to individual goodness through effective altruism, the least effective of the 5 treatments that you do see here, as well as the ones to virtue. Those sort of generalized appeals aren't really all that effective, generally speaking. More than just stating the facts, you can do better with narrative, with facts, or with creating empathy. And so they did look at those first 3 significantly. Then they went a little deeper, and this was the part that made this study most interesting for me. They created this appeal directly. Here's what the organization does. We're asking for $24 per month, and here's what you can do with that. And you can see in bold the changes that they made. So your gift has an impact of $3 on monthly household income versus $56, asset holdings of $10 versus $400, and an increase of monthly income of $6 versus $90. So basically saying to one group of people, you can have 10x the impact the other group of people had. and it didn't make a darn difference. It was less about how much of an impact you have and more that an impact was stated. This goes back to behavioral science and Cialdini. There's a study that came out the year I was born where they asked people to use the Xerox machine in the library. No word on whether microfiche was involved, but this was just copy machine study. So 60% of the time when people said, excuse me, I have 5 pages, may I use the Xerox machine, may I cut in line? People just did it. If you gave a reason, may I use the Xerox machine because I'm in a rush, went up to 94%. And when you did a fake reason, may I use the Xerox machine because I have to make copies? Obviously, you need to make copies. You're using the Xerox machine. That fake reason had almost the same effectiveness as a real reason. We are wired to hear the word because and think, oh, there is a reason coming. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a good reason or a bad reason, just that there's a reason. And so when we look at this, it doesn't necessarily matter. Knowing that your gift makes an impact on asset holdings, on monthly household consumption, on monthly income, that's the important part, not necessarily the dollar amounts that come in there. Okay, we've been talking about this great transfer of wealth that is going to happen from the silent generation and the boomer generation to those who they will predecease in planned giving. And there was an interesting poll out from Harris Poll about what people are planning to do to that. Charities are not in the top places where people are leaving wealth. So children, grandchildren, family members, obviously, we're in that other category, that 8%. Because people could pick multiple options. And then if you're asking, what is the primary purpose of your wealth? Older generations, boomers and silent generation, are more likely to say it's for security, it's for lifestyle. Younger people are able to say legacy building, personal fulfillment, and even philanthropy. So younger people are more likely to call that out. It's 1% versus 3%. So we're around in the margin of error when looking at philanthropy, but is interesting to see. And so there is an interesting opportunity, not just to get the plan gift. There's one organization that we worked with, and I'm looking to take these findings, see if they go across organizations. And if there is, you're going to be hearing more about this. You will not be able to shut me up about this because it's this one organization, 0.4% of their direct marketing donors end up leaving a planned gift. And that doesn't sound huge, but their average planned gift is $100,000. So you take what's 0.4% of $100,000, it's $400. And so the average donor has a expected value of $400 in addition to whatever gifts you would get during their lifetime. If you just knew that, you would say, wow, all of my lifetime value calculations are off because I'm calculating for usually we say lifetime value and we're really looking 3 years, 5 years out. But if every donor, in addition to the donations they make during their lifetime, is also this sort of lottery ticket that has an average expected value of $400 at the end of their life, then the calculation changes significantly. You're willing to pay a lot more to acquire a donor and willing to pay more to steward them during their lifetime. That is interesting and one that I want to continue looking at. We did have a question, what's older and younger? Baby boomers and silent generation are the older, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z are the younger. And I know that throws people off because I'm in the younger generation, and it's very rare that I get to be in the younger generations for these studies. So does this mean that there's an opportunity among young people who get a planned gift who may want to give some of that to charity? And there's some potential evidence for this. A couple of studies, basically, people are more likely to give found money, money that they didn't earn, to charity. There was a study in China, if they earned money, they were 7 to 9 times more likely to give it all to charity if it was a gift instead of something they earned. And then here in the US, they asked college students to give part of a study, the money that they got from a study if they said they were given it versus 19% if they said they earned it by doing the study. So just that change in language to make it look like a windfall, all that mattered was the phrasing, was enough to make them give more to charity. So that idea of found money may be an opportunity and something that we could be tracking. So thank you for putting up with my random neural firings on that, but hopefully that's something that is something that we can delve into. Some news out of AI. There's always news out of AI, but these are hopefully some of the more fun or useful ones. One of the criticisms of AI content is that you get the same sort of homogenized view over and over and over again, because when you prompt, it tends to go toward the most expected items in its bank. And as long as it starts down an expected track, it's especially more likely to finish there. If there are changes early on in the response, it can veer off. But the idea of, and we've talked about this on a previous one, if you ask AI to give you a number between 1 and 50, like half of the time it's going to give you 27, because that's the most popular in human content, and it was trained on that, and it's amplified in that post-training. So how do you get more creative work out of AI? One of the things that I did when I wrote my last book is I prompted AI to say, tell me the story about the love between a pet and its owner. And I did it 10 times in ChatGPT. This was GPT-4 at the time. Out of those 10 times it was a dog, one time it was a cat, and I include it that way because there was a story that had 2 dogs in it. So 10 times, mostly almost entirely dogs. All of the stories, every single one was in a small town that was described as either quaint or picturesque. The human protagonist was a girl named Emily, 6 of them. And I think this is because of Clifford the Big Red Dog, who has Emily Elizabeth as its human protagonist. So when you think love between an owner and their dog, you think Emily Elizabeth and you think dogs. But I didn't put any of that into the prompt. It just kind of said, oh, pet and its owner, it must be talking about a girl, it must be talking about a dog, it must be talking about a quaint village. And so if you're a boy in a city or a cat owner, you're out of luck. You don't see yourself in this. Then when I said, tell me a story about the love between a 17-year-old boy named Colby, who was my nephew, he's now a 20-year-old Marine, so he may not find this as amusing anymore. Colby and his pet lizard. In this story, it went off in a completely different direction about him going off to college, and there was this pet and human love thing, but it had the passage. Some of his friends didn't quite understand his deep attachment to a lizard, and they would tease him for having a weird pet. And so the biases that we have about what is a normal and an abnormal pet are picked up by LLMs. And why this is important is take a look at this approval rating graph. This is about 33% positive, mostly negative. You might look at that graph and say members of Congress, journalists, corporate executives, those are the folks that usually fall in that 30 to 40% approval rating. This was actually the final Gallup poll on the approval rating for Martin Luther King before he died. If you had LLMs trained in 1967, you would have this viewpoint of Martin Luther King, who was then named the second most admired person of the 20th century. And so these biases in machine learning could reinforce ours. So that's why it's important to get creative responses from LLMs. So instead of saying, tell me a joke about copy, you put in, generate X number of responses, and you ask for their corresponding probabilities. What was the likelihood that I was going to get this response? It has to give you multiple items and quantify how likely each of those you were to get. And so, honestly, some of these, not the best joke. Coffee because anger management is too expensive is a little hacky, but not bad. The results of this study weren't that these gave you better responses. They just gave you a greater variety of responses. Here's the way to do it. You can do it in JSON format, but you can use a very simple prompt if you're not going to be that technically. Just say generate responses with their corresponding probabilities. And what you find is that for a poem, for a story, for a joke, and I'll show you in a second for images, direct prompting, you have diversity score of 11.4. And if you're doing this VS sampling prompting, you're almost doubling it for story. You're doubling it for jokes. And so you get a greater variety. And I think images really show this. You ask for an astronaut on a horse in various ways, and it gives you very much the same astronaut on very much the same horses. But when you do verbalized sampling, give me the probabilities, it gives you all sorts of astronauts on horses in different landscapes. Same thing for stories. Write a short story starting with the following prompt. If you direct prompt for that, it's going to have a person named Alara in it. Why Alara? Don't know. It's going to have someone named Liam who cares about him. Why Liam? Don't know. I don't have any Clifford level hypotheses on this one. But if you say sample it, it gives you much more different versions of this. A person moving on from a kindergarten friendship, a sci-fi novel, and a jazz thing. So gives you greater variety. We've talked in the past about how LLMs deliver traffic. Right now, traffic to websites, there's still more traffic from DuckDuckGo than from ChatGPT. And this is across 60,000 websites, mostly on the for-profit side. But there's interesting data from Buffer that traffic from LLMs converts much better than those from organic search. Discovery and consideration, you're having this chat with people ahead of time before they come to your website. They know more, they're more engaged, and they really went through heck to get there. LLMs don't often cite their sources. And so it's hopeful to say, as traffic changes its nature, it may be more likely to convert, even as it is to some extent going away. Most downloaded country song in the United States right now is made by AI called Walk My Walk by a country artist named Breaking Rust, who does not technically exist. On the flip side of AI, there's the organization that puts out ratings of unsafe toys. They've done so for 4 years. It's usually like, don't give your kids a bag of broken glass. But they added a new category for AI tools this year, and there were toys that they put on the list that strongly, if you want to read the report, it is, at some point you will spit coffee all over your screen. The eyes will offer kids advice on where they can find matches or knives in the house, or try to discourage kids from leaving using emotional manipulation. Privacy features on some of these are very non-existent. Plus, they're willing to discuss sexual topics that the researchers were not willing to put into print. If you're considering AI toys, take a look at that list for your kids. Into our potpourri section. Meta, you may have just heard that they won their antitrust suit. I'm sure there's going to be appeals on those sorts of things. But one of the arguments they made during that was that they are not a social media company because social media companies no longer exist. And they made some interesting points in saying that in their legal brief. Only a fraction of the time spent on Meta's services, 7% on Insta, 17% on Facebook, comes from friend sharing. Most people come to watch videos. And so there was data from new young adult viewers back in 2012. Only 8 to 10% wouldn't add a friend in their first 90 days. That's now nearly half. When Meta tweaked their algorithm to give people more friend content, they reduced their time on Facebook. I'd argue that's a good thing, but Meta, I'm sure, would not. If this is an interesting insight, I strongly recommend Tarek Thompson's article, Why Everything Became Television. It's a really interesting look at a post-literate society. The disaster in Chernobyl still has a 30-kilometer exclusion zone where radiation levels are very high. In studying this, there's now a resilient black fungus called Cladosporium sphaerosporum, and they originally found this on the reactor and now are seeing this out in the wild. It is adapted to get energy from radiation levels that would be lethal for other life forces, and it can actually feed on it, and that's how it lives. And so they're studying this to see, hey, can we use this in cleanup zones? And also, can we put this on the inside of spaceships to shelter astronauts from radiation as they are traveling out through space because they don't have an atmosphere to protect them? Sometimes disasters lead to very interesting innovations. I know I've seen that in my direct marketing career, where some of my most interesting results came from me screwing up rather royally. As Terry said in the chat, thank you, Terry. Hope everyone has a happy Thanksgiving and look forward to chatting with you in December. Thanks and have a good day.